Jimmy Page revealed the only band better than Led Zeppelin. There are certain questions in rock music that seem almost impossible to answer. Which guitarist changed the instrument forever? Which album defined an entire generation? Which band deserves to be called the greatest of all time? And then there's a question that has followed Jimmy Page for decades. If anyone could challenge Led Zeppelin, who would it be? The title of this story makes a dramatic claim that Jimmy Page revealed the only band better than Led Zeppelin. But there is an important twist. When the available interviews and historical record are examined, Page's own comments point in almost the opposite direction. Rather than naming another group as superior, Page has repeatedly defended the uniqueness of Led Zeppelin. In a 2019 interview reported by Rolling Stone, he was asked about the greatest band in the world and made it clear that he believed Led Zeppelin stood alone. That makes the real story much more interesting, because Jimmy Page was not simply the guitarist in Led Zeppelin. He was one of the architects of its sound, its studio producer, the musician who assembled Robert Plant, John Paul Jones, and John Bonham, and the person who had spent years learning how records were actually made before Led Zeppelin existed. To understand why Page would be reluctant to place another band above Zeppelin, you have to understand where his musical philosophy came from. Long before millions of people knew the name Jimmy Page, he was a young guitarist in England trying to understand the sounds coming from American blues and early rock records. His development was unusual because he didn't learn music from a single tradition. He absorbed everything he could find. Blues mattered. Folk music mattered. Rock and roll mattered. Studio experimentation mattered. Even the limitations of recording technology became part of his education. As a teenager, Page became increasingly serious about the guitar. He eventually entered London's recording world as a session musician, and that period became one of the most important chapters in his development. Instead of immediately becoming the frontman of a famous rock group, Page spent years working behind the scenes. He played on recordings for major artists and learned what happened inside a studio. When a song moved from an idea to a finished record, he wasn't simply learning guitar parts. He was learning arrangements, microphone placement, production, timing, dynamics, and the strange art turning four musicians into something larger than the sum of their parts. That experience would later become one of Led Zeppelin's greatest advantages. When Page eventually moved toward the Yardbirds, he was no longer simply a guitarist looking for a band. He had a much larger vision. He wanted freedom. He wanted a group capable of moving between blues, heavy guitar music, acoustic textures, folk influences, improvisation, and experimental arrangements without being trapped inside one formula. In a surviving early interview from 1968, Page described Led Zeppelin as a band that could move between different styles rather than remain restricted to one musical direction. He explained that the musicians could follow a feeling and develop ideas together rather than simply reproduce a predetermined formula. That philosophy became crucial because Led Zeppelin's greatest strength was never simply volume. It was contrast. A quiet acoustic passage could suddenly give way to an enormous electric riff. A blues structure could be transformed into something almost orchestral. A straightforward rock song could become an extended improvisation on stage. Page understood that audiences would eventually become bored if every record sounded like the previous one. He said essentially that himself in a 1973 interview. If the band knew exactly what was coming next, the music would become boring, which was why each album needed to be different. That philosophy explains something important about the only band better than Led Zeppelin question. Page wasn't interested in creating a simple hierarchy. He was interested in musical identity. And that is why comparisons between Led Zeppelin and other legendary groups are so difficult. Take the Beatles. Few bands in popular music history had a greater impact on songwriting, recording, studio experimentation, or popular culture. Page himself has spoken about the Beatles' influence, and his later interviews have even connected the group's work to specific Led Zeppelin recordings and production ideas. Does that make the Beatles better than Led Zeppelin? Not necessarily. It makes them different. The Beatles transformed what a popular recording could be. Led Zeppelin transformed what a rock band could sound like. The Rolling Stones offer another comparison. The Stones had an extraordinary connection to blues music and developed a raw, unmistakable identity that lasted for generations. Page knew many musicians from that British blues explosion, and he admired the way the Stones approached recording. In fact, Page once recalled a Yardbirds recording session where his group completed a take, and the producer immediately wanted to move on, while he noted that the Stones would spend considerably more time refining a track. That experience reinforced Page's understanding that recording wasn't simply about finishing quickly. It was about investing time in the music. Then there was The Who. The Who represented another side of British rock. Explosive performances, powerful songwriting, and musicians who could turn a stage into controlled chaos. And yet, Page's own story intersected with The Who in an unexpected way. During the mid-1960s, Page was involved in recording sessions that brought together some remarkable musicians. One such session included Page, Jeff Beck, John Paul Jones, and Keith Moon. According to Page's later recollections, the chemistry was extraordinary, and the idea of forming another band was discussed. That group never became the band people imagined, but something else did. The name Led Zeppelin eventually emerged from that musical world. Page would later explain that the early idea was essentially a collection of musicians capable of creating something powerful together. And when the actual Led Zeppelin lineup came together, the chemistry was even more remarkable. John Paul Jones brought enormous musical versatility. Robert Plant brought a voice that could move from delicate melodies to explosive power. John Bonham brought a rhythmic force that Page himself would later describe as fundamental to the band's identity. And Page brought not only guitar playing but years of arranging, production, and recording experience. The first rehearsal changed everything. Page later described the intensity of the four musicians playing together as something extraordinary. At that moment, the idea of Led Zeppelin stopped being a theory and became a reality. The band's first album demonstrated why the combination worked. But the real surprise came afterward. Many bands become successful by discovering one sound and repeating it. Led Zeppelin did something more dangerous. They kept changing. Led Zeppelin II pushed the heavy side of the band. Led Zeppelin III brought acoustic instruments and folk influences to the front. Led Zeppelin IV combined enormous rock songs with acoustic textures, unusual arrangements, and one of the most famous guitar performances in popular music. Houses of the Holy continued the experimentation. Physical graffiti expanded the band's musical world even further. Presence became more stripped down and guitar-driven. In Through the Outdoor leaned heavily into keyboards and ideas from John Paul Jones. This constant evolution is one of the reasons Page has resisted simplistic comparisons. He knew that Led Zeppelin was not one sound. It was a collection of sounds connected by the chemistry of four musicians. And that chemistry was impossible to reproduce. Page himself has said that when people ask what made Led Zeppelin special, the simplest answer is chemistry. Four talented musicians somehow worked together in a way that created something none of them could have produced alone. That may be the most important clue to the entire story. Because if you're looking for a band better than Led Zeppelin, what exactly are you measuring? Album sales? Influence? Songwriting? Live performances? Technical musicianship? Cultural impact? Longevity? Studio innovation? Different bands win different categories. The Beatles arguably changed popular music more profoundly. The Rolling Stones created one of rock's longest-running identities. Pink Floyd transformed the possibilities of album-oriented rock. Black Sabbath helped establish the foundation for heavy metal. The Who became one of the great live rock acts. But Led Zeppelin occupied an unusual position because they combined so many qualities. They were heavy without being exclusively heavy. They were blues-based without being limited to traditional blues. They were experimental without abandoning powerful songwriting. They could perform quietly and explosively. And they could transform a song on stage into something completely different from the studio recording. That last quality was especially important to Page. He believed that music should remain alive. A Led Zeppelin concert wasn't simply the reproduction of an album. Songs could stretch, change, and develop. A familiar riff could become the beginning of an extended musical journey. The band's musicianship allowed them to take risks because each member trusted the others. And then there was the studio. Page's years as a session musician had prepared him for this role. He wasn't satisfied with simply recording for musicians playing into microphones. He thought about sound as architecture. Guitars could be layered. Acoustic and electric instruments could interact. Different microphone positions could create radically different textures. Silence could be as important as volume. The recording itself could become part of the composition. That approach helped give Led Zeppelin albums a distinctive character. In a later interview, Page explained that the group wanted the recordings to represent real performances rather than constructing songs piece by piece through modern editing techniques. That philosophy also explains why the band remains so difficult to imitate. Thousands of guitarists can learn a Jimmy Page riff. Thousands of singers can attempt Robert Plant's melodies. Thousands of drummers can study John Bonham. Thousands of bass players can learn John Paul Jones's parts. But putting all four musical personalities together is another matter entirely. You can reproduce the notes. You can't reproduce the chemistry. And that is where the idea of a superior band begins to fall apart. Jimmy Page wasn't operating under the assumption that Led Zeppelin was competing with every other band on a scoreboard. He was building something that he believed had its own identity. That's why one of the most revealing things Page has said about Led Zeppelin came years after the band's breakup. He explained that no member of Led Zeppelin, including himself, was supposed to become bigger than Led Zeppelin itself. Think about that. Page could have spent the rest of his life trying to prove that he was the greatest guitarist alive. Instead, he repeatedly returned to the idea of the band. The four musicians mattered more than any individual. That is why the death of John Bonham in 1980 was so devastating. Led Zeppelin didn't simply lose its drummer. It lost one of the four elements that made the chemistry possible. Page, Plant, and Jones could continue making music, but the exact combination that created Led Zeppelin no longer existed. The band officially ended. There were later reunions and collaborations, but none could completely recreate the original chemistry. The 2007 reunion at London's O2 Arena demonstrated how powerful that legacy remained. Jason Bonham, John's son, played drums, and surviving members delivered a performance that reminded the world why the original lineup had become legendary. But even that reunion was treated as an event rather than the beginning of a permanent replacement version of Led Zeppelin. And perhaps that was the right decision. Because if Page truly believed another band was better, he wouldn't need to diminish Zeppelin to prove it. He could appreciate other musicians while still recognizing what his own band accomplished. And he has done exactly that. Page has spoken positively about artists from completely different musical traditions. He has expressed admiration for punk. He has worked with musicians outside the traditional Zeppelin sound. He has explored Indian musical ideas. He has collaborated with other guitarists. He has worked with younger generations. His musical curiosity never disappeared. That matters because it reveals something about the man behind the myth. Jimmy Page didn't become Jimmy Page by believing there was only one correct form of rock music. He became Jimmy Page by listening. He listened to blues players. He listened to folk musicians. He listened to rock and roll. He listened to studio recordings. He listened to other guitarists. Then he took those influences and transformed them. That was the Led Zeppelin formula. Not imitation. Transformation. Page's own words about Led Zeppelin's creative philosophy make this especially clear. He described wanting to combine blues, hard rock, and acoustic music with heavy choruses, creating a combination he believed had not been done in that particular way before. That's why the greatest compliment another band could receive from Page would not necessarily be that it was better. It would be that it was original. Led Zeppelin itself was built on that principle. The band borrowed from earlier traditions. Blues musicians influenced its guitar language. Folk music influenced its acoustic side. Classical ideas influenced its arrangements. Eastern musical traditions appeared in some of its experiments. But Zeppelin didn't simply replay the past. It changed the ingredients. And that is the difference between influence and imitation. A band that copies Led Zeppelin may sound impressive for a few minutes. A band that understands why Led Zeppelin mattered has to go further. It has to create something new. That's the lesson Page's career provides. And it may also explain why the claim that he revealed a single band better than Led Zeppelin has become so attractive online. The headline creates instant curiosity. Fans want to know the name. Was it the Beatles? The Rolling Stones? Pink Floyd? Black Sabbath? The Who? Maybe another legendary group? But the evidence doesn't support a straightforward confession like that. In fact, the available reporting on Page's comments points in the other direction. When asked about the greatest band in the world, Page defended Led Zeppelin's unique status rather than naming a superior competitor. And that makes a headline more complicated, but also more honest. The real revelation is not that Jimmy Page secretly believed another band was better. It's that he understood why comparing legendary bands as though they were sports teams doesn't really work. Imagine asking whether the Beatles were better than Led Zeppelin. You could spend hours arguing. Then someone could ask whether Pink Floyd was better, then Black Sabbath, then the Rolling Stones, then The Who. Eventually, the argument becomes less about music and more about definitions. What does better mean? If it means commercial impact, the answer changes. If it means guitar innovation, the answer changes.